You're listening to Girls with Grafts, a burn community podcast created by Phoenix Society for Burn Survivors, a leading nonprofit dedicated to supporting the burn community. In this podcast, we'll talk with burn survivors, share resources to help with supporting and improving burn recovery, and discuss how to prevent burn injuries. Here are your hosts, burn survivors and Phoenix Society's marketing team, Amber Wilcox and Rachel Anderson.
Hello and welcome back to Girls with Grafts. I am Rachel Anderson and I'm one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host Amber Wilcox.
Hey there. So excited we're back for another episode. And today we have a very special guest. I know we always say that, but today is really special. And I'm very excited to have you introduce her. But before we do, I do want to send over a special thank you to our season 1 podcast sponsor, Pritzker Hagman. And with that, Rachel, you want to kick us off today?
Yes. I'm very excited to introduce Jennifer Harris, a clinical social worker and therapist based in Boston, Massachusetts. Jennifer Harris works with people living with life transitions, trauma, bereavement, end of life, grief, and life losses, as well as chronic illnesses and burns, with compassion while also acknowledging the unique experience of each person. Jen has an in-depth training in trauma-informed care with over 15 years working in private practice and in a hospital trauma medical service. She has extensive experience working with loss, grief, trauma, developmental trauma, crisis intervention, intimacy, and adjusting to a new normal. In addition to her work as a therapist, Jen volunteers as a Healing Circle leader for Comfort Zone Camp, a youth and family bereavement organization, and is a valued member of Phoenix Society, which is familiar if you've joined one of our virtual Monday evening support groups. So thank you so much, Jen. That was one heck of an intro and a bio. I'm so happy to have you here.
Oh, you guys, thank you so much. I am so honored. It's so great to see you.
We're so thankful that you've joined us, especially with Christmas right around the corner, Jen. And while this can be a really exciting time for a bunch of folks, today's podcast is very special because I think this is an area that you're specifically really passionate about, but also very, have a great expertise in. And so today we're going to talk a little bit more about grief. And we're really thankful that you're joining us so close to the holiday season.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. This is, it's such a tough time of year for so many people, and balancing loss and losses of life, but also this high expectation to have lots and lots of joy and expectations, and things might be looking different. And so how do we find that balance to still have some joy, but acknowledge what we have lost, what we're adjusting to, right? Yeah.
Definitely. And, like you said, the holidays can be joyful, but that's definitely not the case for everyone. And, you can even have ebbs and flows. Maybe one day you have a little extra Christmas spirit and the next day you may not. And that's okay, too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's just pull it back one moment. And can you just kind of give us, I don't know, your definition or what exactly grief means to you, or what grief is?
Yeah, what grief is. I think grief is truly, I think there's kind of two types of grief. So we're going to kind of wrap them into one. So for people who have lost a person, right? That's, I think, how we traditionally think of grief. And certainly that is grief. I think I heard a quote, but that, it's truly the absence of the essence of love from that person. That quote really resonated with me. But the other things I think we don't think about that we go experience grief with are life losses, right? Things that I've lost in my life. It could be a job. It could be my life before trauma. It could be, my providers switching. There's lots of things that we can experience in this community of loss, right? And how we experience and acknowledging that, this might be grief that I'm experiencing for this. Sometimes I think we don't even know how to name it because it's not the loss of a specific person in our life, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. And I think, so there's lots of questions and things to unpack there, right? Like loss in general, like grief is a lot about that idea of loss. today we're, burn injuries are a big element where we may experience some grief. But I want to talk a little bit because I know I've heard this, but I also know I've thought this myself of how long am I going to feel like this, right? Or how long is this grief going to ask? And I think that's a common question that you've probably received quite a bit. But I want to dive into that. And, I think I know the answer, but I would love to hear from you of like, when you get that question, how do you respond?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think often in grief, we are so rushed to not have to, I don't want to feel this anymore, right? And I think people will often, in asking that question, probably the first thing that pops in their head or the first thing that someone will say to them who's maybe doesn't work in this field is, it just takes time. But that's such a kind of cliche thing to say. It really gives us comfort. And I've given you something that's comforting, but you're like, well, what does that mean? How will I know? Right? How much time? 3 months, 2 years, 20 years? What is that? And I think thinking about grief is throughout our lifespan, certainly loss of a person, because that love that we have for them and the experience we had with them doesn't leave us, right? So that might ebb and flow. The organization that I volunteer for, the founder, Lynn Hughes, always says, grief is sort of that experience. Like when it initially happens, it's like right in your face. And as we move on, grief moves with us. But as we allow ourselves to experience the emotions, as we allow ourselves to experience and acknowledge what we're experiencing, as we honor that person, as we do the new 6 stage of grief, some meaning making, not why did this happen necessarily, but what do I do with this? What's meaningful to me? Allowing ourselves to have more of those moments, grief can start to move away, right? And start to move in different directions in our lives. And sometimes things are going to happen where it kind of feels like it's right back in your face. But it doesn't mean that we can't get back to having it be further away from us, but it's still kind of always a little bit around.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that too, about the anniversary effect. I feel like that comes up a lot, whether, for burns, it's your burn anniversary or the loss of someone, that anniversary. But
or a trigger, right?
Yeah. What should we look out for, or how should you prepare if you know those anniversaries are coming?
Yeah. How to prepare? Well, I think oftentimes we make the day of the leading up to the anticipation of it a much bigger deal than it is. Like, it's like, my whole, like, this day is going to be so horrible. I'm going to relive it. I'm going to relive those emotions, but you can't relive it, right? You can't go back to that space. You can acknowledge it. Our bodies often will keep track of the traumas, right? That we've had. So I think just acknowledging this might be a tough day for me. It might not be a tough day for me, but I'm going to give myself grace, permission to have the feelings I need to have. I can be angry. I can be angry leading up to it. I can be angry on that day. I can just ask my friends to support me, or I can spend the day alone, right? I can also say, I don't know what I'm going to need. So let me see how that day goes. And I might need to spend a day in bed crying. I might need to be out in the world and celebrating life, or I need to be just maybe sitting down and having a cupcake,
Right.
I think there is this thing we forget, that we have this intuition. We're often so looking to not have to feel these sad things, but if we feel them, they move through us, right? They've truly moved through us. And so if we just acknowledge that I'm going to just see and pay attention to my gut instinct of what I need.
Just hold that space for yourself, I think, is really important.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that's so helpful, because I know we get asked a lot, just like, how should I celebrate my burn anniversary? And I think that's the one, or how, what is the best way to? And I think there is no specific way, right? And you're validating that with what you just said of like, if I want to eat a cupcake on my burn anniversary, I'm going to eat a cupcake. Or if I want to sit in bed and cry, like, that is okay. But we get asked out of like, how should I, and what is the best way to? And I don't from what you're saying, it sounds like there's no best way, right?
I don't think there is a best way. And I might invite, if the space feels okay, or you're looking for, if people are looking for something to sort of like honor, to do that sort of meaningful, that meaning making, that's now being talked about in grief, the loss of a person, we might honor them that day. Right? We might go, I lost my brother. Sometimes I go to the zoo because he loved monkeys, and I make sure to go do that. Or I'll go to the beach because we put his ashes in the water. And I know when I'm around water, I feel closer to him. Right. So I might do things like that. But I think there's also, in like the losses we've had in our burn, right, and our trauma, I think there's also maybe some reflecting back on, what have I gained that I wasn't able to do initially, right? I didn't even think I would be able to do this, right? And not in like a toxic positivity way, but it's like acknowledging what you've lost, but also acknowledging maybe what has been gained from that. That makes sense?
Yeah, like what are I know my first burn anniversary, my husband and I had done a couple things, but one of the ways that we acknowledged it was to go for a 5K, right? Did a walk together. And on each mile, my husband, it was actually his idea. He's like, let's talk about on this mile, like all of the things we're grateful for in the hospital. And then let's talk about all of the things we're grateful for that you've been able to accomplish since then. And so we took it as like a gratitude walk rather than a solitude walk. And I think that for me, that was very helpful because I took that, like I used that reframing and framed it in like, here's what I'm thankful for rather than like how I'm sad.
Yeah, absolutely. And
so
I think that's so great. Well, I think that's so great too. And I just want to honor too, for people who are in different spaces in their healing journey, right? Like I think people are like, if I do this, then I won't have to feel this. And I don't think that's true. And some people might be like, I can't access that. I'm too angry. The loss feels too deep right now to be able to access like I will never get there. I wouldn't say never, but I also wouldn't force doing something like that. Like if that doesn't resonate with you, don't do it. But keep it in mind, because one day in a couple of years, it might feel something that feels okay to do.
Definitely. And you kind of talk a little bit about like almost like these cycles of grief, but what are some signs should you be looking out for when it, maybe becomes unhealthy or even dangerous? What are some of those signs?
Well, that's a good question. Signs that the grief is kind of taking over and consuming you.
Or been, I think maybe unhealthy or dangerous, right? I think we know some of those common signs, but yeah.
Well, I think misuse of substances is for sure one, right? We're trying to avoid, we're trying to numb. So that is something to think about. If your drinking intake has increased, if your narcotic intake has increased, that's something certainly to pay attention to. Sometimes our physical pain, might flare up. You might want to listen to that, right? Pay attention to your body. If your body feels more tense, if you're feeling more anxious, more depressed, for sure, that could be signs of like my grief is feeling really intense right now. It's really kind of consuming me. Sometimes we don't even pay attention. We don't even realize that we're building up anxiety, right? If you're not thinking about specifically that person, that could be it. So being overwhelmed, and to that point of being overwhelmed, like if you're irritable, if you're snapping at everybody and your road rage is acting up, right? You are angry at the world. If you have no tolerance for your loved ones, it might be a sign that you're overwhelmed. That might be a sign that you are experiencing grief more, right?
Yeah. And, kind of to that same effect, I'm someone that maybe it's not with grief, but just when I get stressed out, I stay busy. I like constantly have to be doing things. Yep. So even though, could that kind of be in the same vein as like, if you are, your drinking has increased to suppress those feelings, is almost being too busy and not living in those feelings also an unhealthy trait?
Or I guess like not acknowledging, right? Like seeing that person went from an extreme loss to not acknowledging. Is that something we should be worried about, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I struggle with like we think about like this word of like what's healthy, unhealthy. And I talk with my clients about that. I'm like, I don't really like that sort of, it feels like right or wrong. Right. And everything is coping. It's just, is it working for you? Right. Like, so sometimes we might need to overwork, right? We just might need to do that because we're not ready to do that. But I think it could also be a sign that like, okay, but I can do that. But if I'm starting to be reactive, it might be a sign that not only am I exhausted from overworking, but I'm avoiding being present and sitting with what is actually going on, what I'm actually experiencing in my life, right? So there's that balance. I think having the awareness, listening to the people around you, being like, why are you working so much? I need you. What are you doing? Why aren't you here? Similarly of, our loved ones, when they say, God, you're so angry and snapping, like, do anything, it's easy to take those things personally, but that might be signs that, okay, maybe I've got to take a step back here, maybe really acknowledge with what I'm really experiencing.
I love that. So speaking of people around you, right? I know we've all probably experienced or been around someone who maybe has experienced loss or grief of some kind, right? Whether it's the loss of a loved one or loss of, or experiencing trauma. And I think I've heard this too of like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to support this person. And maybe I'm so afraid of doing it. Either I don't, or I'm so afraid of it. Like, I don't know what to say because sometimes sorry doesn't feel right with us or whatnot. So what is a good, or what, there's no right or wrong. So what is a good way that you, or ways that you would say, I know as a burn survivor, I have my idea of how I wanted folks to support me. But when it comes to grief and loss, what is the best or a good way to support that person? I think a lot to unpack.
A lot to unpack. Yeah. This is going to sound so simple. And you're right. I think people experiencing grief, I hear this with the kids that I work with all the time. They don't want to hear I'm sorry because you didn't do anything, right? And people, and I think I'm sure the two of you have experienced, I also don't want someone to pity me. I don't want someone, when I share my story or I share what I'm experiencing in this moment, I don't need you to fix it for me. Right? Like that. It's like that. If anything, that makes it feel worse, right? Because you can't fix it for me. But
I also don't know how to respond. So I feel like when you say I'm sorry to me, I'm like, this is awkward. I don't really know how to respond to your sorry.
Absolutely. Right. And then there's also that piece of like, I think when people go to fix it, and you're like, no, I'm good. Like, I don't like, it's actually, I don't truly don't need you to fix it for me. Like those are not, I didn't ask for that. Right. I am just expressing how I feel. I'm expressing what I'm experiencing right now. And the other piece of that too is, the pitying piece that people get like, oh my God, that sounds horrible. I'm like, and then people will jump into that. I'm sorry. Right. Well, again, you didn't do anything, but now I feel like I have to take care of your emotions for you.
Right.
Your discomfort of my discomfort.
Right.
So, I think the biggest thing people can do, when they hear that, when they hear someone step into that vulnerability to express it, or they notice it, is just to say, and that sucks. What do you need? How can I help?
Yeah.
Or I'd like to listen, right? I'm here. I can listen. I think so often people will be like, well, I'm here, if you need anything, and you're like, okay, but am I going to reach out to you? I don't know. But it's actually that moment of someone sharing something to say, I am here. I'm ready to listen. Do you want to talk now? You want to talk later? I'm here. Right?
Yeah. I think this is from a Brene Brown book, but one of my favorite things to say, and if my friends are listening, they may have heard me say this exact phrase, but I just say like, I'm not exactly sure what to do to help, but I'm here to listen. And absolutely. I think owning, if you're not sure what to do, which is totally fine, but owning that also when I hear that from my friends, I'm like, phew, like, what, I'm actually not sure what I need you to do, but I just want to know.
I want you to hold space. Yeah. And I think that's something that I learned from my trauma of like beforehand, I might have tried to jump and say, I'm sorry, or said you should, or like, this is what, and we've learned from that peer support of like, it's okay to just sit with that person in that uncomfortable space and say like, I don't know how to help you, but I'm here for you.
Yeah.
Like, thank you for telling me. Like, thank you for, you know, it's almost like it's a compliment when someone is willing to tell you about their feelings or open up to you. It's like they trust you.
Vulnerable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for us to just sit in that, and it's hard. It is really hard. We're in this country hardwired for whatever reason to fix it for somebody, right? Like we're not supposed to experience our pain and not supposed to experience our suffering, or anxiety or our depression, but actually so much, as you two know, I'm a neuroscience nerd. So much of the research is showing if we do feel those feelings over time, we start to feel them a little less intensely, maybe a little less often. They feel easier to tolerate, right? And so if we can give that space to somebody, what a gift we're giving them, right? To say, I see you. It's okay. I'm here.
And I think it's a powerful thing to learn, but sometimes it takes us experiencing it ourselves to be able to know how to hold space for others. And I think that was something that I was like, you know what? I don't have to say I'm sorry because I hate hearing I'm sorry because that's just not like, and so now I try to avoid saying I'm sorry because I think I'm like, why am I apologizing for something that I really didn't affect me? I think it's easier for me to then just go in and say, what do you need? Like you said, I think that's a great option of like, maybe I don't need anything, but you to just sit there and listen to me. So, that's a very powerful tool to learn.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask too is, do you have, I don't know if it's like tips or like when, for example, when a life is lost and there's more, let's say a couple or a brother and sister, or there's multiple people who are going through grief at the same time, but also want to support others. Is there a way that you can balance that, managing your own grief, but also helping someone else?
That's also a big question, right? I think I'll speak first from sort of a familiar, like family point of view, just from the families that I've worked with and kids I've worked with. And the parents that I've worked with, when they've lost either a parent or a sibling or someone they've loved dearly, one of the biggest things, big topics that always comes up every single time I work with families, is I don't want to make them upset. Right? If I talk about my loved one or I don't want to make someone upset. But one of the things that I point out is what's making everyone upset is the loss of that person, right? That's what makes everyone upset. That's what everybody has emotions about and feelings about and grief about. So if we are bringing up our own grief, doesn't it make sense of the loss of a shared person? Doesn't it make sense that the other people in our families, when we talk about them, would also have emotions about their own grief, right? So those emotions are their own grief, right? And if we have them together, we can share joy of that person, celebrate their life. We can share our sadness. And sometimes in grief, when we bring it up, other people are in different spaces because of what's going on in life, right? Being able to tolerate that so that, we actually as a family unit kind of have an agreement, come up with some skills to create that open space to be like, okay, right now, I know you're feeling your grief, but I need to get your siblings to all these things. Let's make sure tonight we come together. You and I spend time together talking about dad, right? I think same thing similarly with our family shared experience of burns, right? We all know, like our partners, our parents, our siblings, they all experience the trauma, just in a different way, right? And so how do we, even though the injury happened to us, the trauma of them, our loved one got hurt and there's nothing I can do about it, right? I can't fix it. So how do we all have agreement that we can all have grief about that, right? We can all experience trauma in a different way. We are not here that doesn't make me talking about it doesn't make you upset. It's it's what I experienced or what we experienced that hurts, right? That suffering that hurts, that pain that hurts.
I think that's important because so many of us are like, oh, should we not say anything, right? Like, I don't know if I should avoid talking about it.
I don't want to make you upset. And like, well, why not? Why can't I be? It's my grief. It's my trauma. Like, if you don't think I don't have feelings about it, I'm not having those feelings. It's not you who's making me upset. It's events that happened. Loss.
So speaking, I think just of talking about it, I know grief comes in many forms, right? And so one of the things that I think from our community I've heard, and I wanted to ask you about today was, we look at losses out that don't necessarily or aren't necessarily in our immediate family, right? But there are losses that still in some ways affect us. So I know a lot of our community was affected by the loss of Anne Hesh. And so, the survivors felt something about that accident, and I still think or whether it's, we hear about wildfires out there. So while that didn't directly affect us because we didn't necessarily know that person, we still felt something deeply about that. Can we talk about that for a minute or just hold space to understand, why when I see something on the news or on TV about an accident that happened maybe similarly to me or to someone else, why do I feel something right during that?
So why do we connect with other people's suffering when we've experienced suffering? Because we're human. We need people. We need to be with people. And even if sometimes it just feels like I don't want to be with the world, right? But we're social creatures. We need to be with other people. And so for us to connect to someone else's suffering, it makes sense, right? Because not only do I know what she went through, even though I'm still here and she's deceased, I can imagine what she went through, right? And how it was for her to suffer in the hospital and suffer through that, right? But then also for her family, right? Like we might be really connected, like, oh my gosh, my family was so concerned about me, her family experiencing, right? So it makes sense that we would connect deeply to someone else's trauma when we've experienced a similar thing.
Well, I think that, kind of goes back to what Phoenix Society always says of like each burn survivor is unique, but our journeys are so similar. And we all, that's why you can connect to, one another at World Burn Congress and other things so easily is maybe my injury is completely different from yours, but we have this common story still.
We have this common understanding, right? I know I can look at you and you may not look like I do. Your injuries may not look like mine do. Your injuries might have happened from a different way than mine did. But do we have a shared understanding that's not being talked about just by being amongst each other? Absolutely. And there is this sort of like, I think that's what's so wonderful. I know just like you all know how much I love peer support, supporting that with the Phoenix Society, but to have that space in our grief and our trauma and our loss to not be alone can be one of the most powerful things in our healing, right? To get back to that normal of what it feels like to not feel alone, invite that back in, but to share it with others and like, oh, you get it, right? I'm not the only one here in the world who's gone through this. Lots of people, we all know that, but to actually experience that, to be in the presence of others who've been through similar emotions that we've had, gosh, the power and the healing in that is huge. So yes, we are social creatures. I think we do healing. There's a lot of healing that we do on our own, but there's a lot of healing we do in support of others, specifically people who've experienced loss, trauma that we have.
And why, I know we've said we're social creatures, but really why is peer support so powerful? Like why does it make sense?
And I know we've talked about that one-on-one of how much you love peer support. And we are going to be talking about that more in a little sneak peek that we have an upcoming episode with Jen as well. But I think, peer support and grief. Let's talk that.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that then. But I do think not to give a cliffhanger, but again, just back to that idea of the relief that people feel of not feeling alone is that I'm not the only one. That what I'm experiencing as normal is huge, but we will talk more about that. But I think reach out to others, right? All the more important, I think, in grief, it feels hard to reach out to others. I think grief can be so isolating for us, so isolating.
Mm-hmm.
No one gets how I loved this person. You're right. No one's going to get that. But if other people love someone deeply, absolutely. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Is your relationship to, your mom different than your brother's, than your dad's? Absolutely. Right. Because we're all, those relationships are unique to us. But does that mean that we all aren't missing her?
Mm-hmm.
We are. Right. And so I think when people come together in peer support, which we'll talk, again, still cliffhanger, but
okay, we can get into it a little bit here today.
Just the power of that. So reach in grief, and we can reach out to others, find that community of people who've lost someone, people who've maybe experienced loss of a job. If we've lost a job, right? Those people get it. It's hard. If we've lost, I know a lot of amputees have a lot of peer support, right, with each other. And I know I work with folks who've had transplant, they're transplant groups, right? I mean, there's just so much that's out there. It makes sense. Find community.
Mm-hmm.
Find community.
I think just knowing, like, right, especially in peer support, as somebody who's an avid fan of peer support myself, I've been going 2 years strong, I think, here in peer support, but knowing that, and sometimes, like, I think you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, Jen, in the terms of, like, okay, it's great that you helped me with that lotion that I needed for the itch, but hearing from you telling me, like, hey, it's okay that you are feeling scared about going to the doctor next week, because I also feel that because of all the trauma I went through, like, that in and of itself is actually way more healing for me in some ways than what kind of lotion you used. Am I wrong there?
No, I don't think you're wrong there at all. Right? Because I mean, we're all going to figure out what kind of lotion we need. And, and across the country, Pam Peterson and I talk about this a lot. Like, so interesting how vastly different and similar, but different surgeons and different providers have different points of views, and what's the best lotion? Do you do vitamin E? Do you not do vitamin E? Like, all that stuff, so figuring out what works for you. It's great to have get ideas from that. But how was it to hear that, like, oh no, what you're feeling, I experienced that too. Right. A person who's actually experienced it, like, as a clinician, and then as a person who's not a burn survivor, I can be like, oh, what you're experiencing is completely normal. I will often say with my clients, like, listen, I have 5 other clients who are feeling that this week too. Right. I can say that, but to hear it from somebody who's actually, has experienced it, it's more validating, right? It does actually feel a little bit more whatever normal is, right?
Yeah, I think I feel, and I don't like to use the term crazy, right? But I feel like, oh, am I like going spiraling out of control here and thinking this, or are you validating how I feel right now?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're talking a lot about grief. Yeah. But I think for me, we hear too, there's the survivors that are burned as adults, but then we also have, some of us as adults have children, and then some of us are also experiencing loss, right, with children there. So I want to talk a little bit about, like, grief when it comes to children, because I've heard a couple schools of thought, right, of like, ooh, I don't want to expose them to what happened for fear, or is it, or sometimes I've heard, how do I talk to my kids about this, or how do I tell them what happened? So can we let's sit on that for a little bit and talk about, when it comes to children and grief, you work a lot with them. So what are some tips or ways that you recommend starting that conversation with kids?
Yeah. So transparency. You cannot protect your child from what has happened in their life. Kids are incredibly perceptive. they know something is up.
Mm.
They can handle it. They can also handle it, and they can have big feelings about it. They can have anxiety about it. They can have sadness about it. But if we don't tell them, they feel like, I will tell you, every single kid I have worked with whose loved one protected them from how their loved one died. This often happens in the suicide loss community. We don't want to tell the kids because then they're going to become suicidal. It's not a thing. It's actually like the research shows it's not a thing. That hearing that someone died by suicide isn't going to make the people in their life want to die by suicide, and not for kids, right? If we're transparent with them and say, this is how they died, right? But using age-appropriate language, is really important. So what you might say to a 13-year-old would not be what you say to a 5-year-old. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Namely,
you want to give us an example of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, developmentally, where a kid is at 13 is different than where a kid is at 5. So the concept of like 3, 4, maybe 5, the concept of like permanency and death isn't like, that's not a concept that their brains can grasp yet, right? So you might say, you can use the word die, like, right? Let's not like sugarcoat it. Idea of like permanency isn't fully there. So I think that can be exhausting for parents when they have kids that age. It's like, I don't think they get it. And they didn't have big emotions about it. Yeah, they didn't, because they don't really, their brains can't comprehend what that means, someone not being here. It's like, oh, are they going to still come home from, after work? Like, right. So there's that. But a 13-year-old fully understands the permanency of death. And a teenager, even older than that, fully understands. And there's also this idea of, if someone has been in their life and they've had more time to formulate a relationship with them, like in junior high or a teenager, they've formulated a relationship based on who they are as well. Does that make sense? Like, you start to learn about who you are, and relationship to other people. And so it's not just that they've had more time, they had more time to develop a relationship with that person. So they might experience grief a little bit differently there. But a 13-year-old, and maybe even what you might want to say to them is to share how it happened, right? And to also offer, I think, to all kids, if you have questions, come ask me. If you want more detail, I am here for you. I will talk to you about that. So what often will happen is we'll see kids who will, have lost someone when they were young, 9, 10 years old, and then they become a teenager and they're like, I want to hear more of the story, because they're trying to make sense of the story in their head, right? And that can also be exhausting for parents if they've lost their spouse or their own child, right? To have to do that. But unfortunately, you're the holder of that information. Something that parents can do also is to say, I really want to share that with you. I don't have those answers. Are you okay if I connect you with, Uncle Bob or with Grandma and Grandpa? That, we can also elicit other people in our life to help support that child in sharing stories and sharing more detail if that person has it, or being there with them. So, I don't know, that was a lot.
No, that was, I think, very helpful, because I think, and so I want to go a little bit further and like, okay, so there's the loss of a person, right? But the loss of, or receiving a burn injury. And so sometimes we're asked, like, how should I talk to that child? We don't want to go into those gory details, but I would assume that the same applies here, right? Of like, age appropriate language to talk about a burn injury. Is that
absolutely? I think that age, I think exactly right. Like maybe with a 3 or 4-year-old, you'd say that, they had a burn. It was because of fire. This is why fire, this is why we teach that fire is dangerous, right? Why we wear mittens, because of frostbite, right? And to say, and that's how we can help protect ourselves. But sometimes people still can get hurt, and, and they are getting medical care. The doctors and nurses are taking care of them. And right now we think that they're going to be okay, right? Or we can know that, right? I mean, this also is dependent on the size of, but I think we can say, I don't think we have to get into details about percentages with kids. Maybe a teenager, and just to say, it's on a large part of their body. or we can say, as we learn more, like, as someone is healing and learning more about what their bodies might look like or what scars, we can have those conversations. We can say to kids, like, there's going to be some scarring, and, we have to be careful on touching daddy for the next year, right? We can touch him. We can ask him to be touched, but we do need to be careful. Or if it's their sibling, to say, we need to just be careful. We need to be a little bit more mindful, just so that their scars don't open back up, right? Like they're still healing, but they're still here. There's, and so I think there's going to be supporting kids in the loss of, this is a change that's happened. Like, I may not be able to roughhouse with my sibling like I used to, right? We can be sad for that. Let's find something else that we can do. Let's introduce a new activity, right?
I love that.
Yeah. And so I know we talked a little bit about this in your intro, but can you tell us a little bit more about the comfort zone camps? And is that something how does that kind of work into talking with kids and families about grief?
Yeah. So Comfort Zone Camp is an organization that was started 22 years ago by Lynn Hughes, and she had lost both of her parents at different times when she was young. And one of the things she discovered in her isolation of her grief and not being talked about around her, one of the things she found she loved in her early life was going to camp. And so she had this idea, and it was a time it was freeing, and she felt connected, and it was community for people who've been to camp. And, we have a lot of people in our community go to burn camps, volunteer at burn camps. It's a sort of similar thing, right? Of like just being around other kids who have that. But what's different about Comfort Zone Camp is it's a weekend, and it really mimics how kids experience grief. So what's unique to Comfort Zone Camp is that we have healing circles, and healing circles are led by people who are experted in the grief field, either their own grief and they've been to camp, or their mental health clinician like myself who's also experienced grief. And we lead 4 healing circles. Each kid has an adult connected to them to keep them safe, kind of like a mentor, a person to just be a listening ear, even if they have experienced grief. And so throughout the weekend, we have these really fun sort of highs of high energy, icebreakers, fun games. And then we move into healing circle and we share our stories, right? And we explore what grief has been like, the changes that it has created, not just the loss of that person, but the changes that it has created in our life, right? The absence of that person, what is different, and feeling more connected to others to be like, hey, I got you. I've experienced that too, right? So the power of that. And then, and then we go, again, flow in and out of fun activities and archery and swimming. And then we do this awesome in the evening bonfire where we do a circle of remembrance. And you guys, I have to tell you, you'll be very proud of me. I am like the safety, like I think I drive like safety item around bonfires. So, but we write notes to our loved ones, and we put those notes, we have a circle of remembrance, and we write these notes and put them in the healing and put them in the fire. A message where all of our messages flow into maybe finding their way to our loved one. But it's really truly a time to, especially for kids, I think we often, kids will wait to go to the cemetery or wait for the family to talk about their loved one, or, and so it's really a time for them to remember their loved one in their own safe way, right? And the support of this community.
Yeah. And I think that's powerful because we hear so much, like, not just with kids, but adults, like writing can be very, very healing. I know I've had family members that have experienced loss, and I've given that recommendation of like, hey, write it down, like write them a letter. Because I think that for me has been really helpful. Do you find that being healing for kids, not and adults, I think, right?
Oh, it's so healing for kids. And, and some people are not in a place to be able to do it. They're like, I have nothing to say, sometimes in our grief, I think we forget that sometimes I think in grief, we can put our loved one on a pedestal, but not everybody was on a pedestal when they were living. So just because they've died and they're no longer here doesn't mean that they deserve to be on a pedestal. Right. And so sometimes it is hard to write a note to a loved one, but I do think it's a way we can do that. And I also think what's also great about Comfort Zone Camp, and want to bring us back to sort of like kids' experiences and how we forget how differently they do things than we do, is that we do this really cool thing. It's called a memorial service, and it is child focused. And we let the kids get up there and they dance. They dance the solo of their dance because their dad didn't get to see it, right? Or we had one kid who had lost their twin sibling, and the last thing they did together was Easter egg hunt. So this kid did a little Easter egg hunt, right? And I think we forget, or people play songs. Like this was my mom's favorite song, right? Or we went fishing, or hey, we always get like, it's kind of like 9-10-year-old girls who were like put together a little dance act, and sometimes a boiled because they want to like show like how happy they've been. Like even in my grief, I can be happy because that's how kids are. They will be happy one moment and they'll be sad another moment, and that's okay. And I think we forget to let children do what they need. We forget that they actually do sometimes know what they need to do, right?
Right.
So if they are playing or reenacting things, it's okay.
And that makes perfect sense because we as adults do that too, right? Like I may need to eat a cupcake, but Rachel may want to go cry it out, right? And I think that's
absolutely. And I think we think as adults that, like what's appropriate or not appropriate. Like we're very like sometimes it's appropriate in grief to be funny, to be silly, to scream at the top of our lungs, to dance around, to go fishing, to play. Right. Sometimes in grief, it's not just about being sad. And then as a good friend of mine said, it's not about moving. It's not about moving on. It's moving with. Right.
And you're holding such beautiful space with those Comfort Zone camps. So I think that's really, really
program. It's a free program. So, and kids can come, and now we do a parent program, which is super awesome. So I've been doing those and giving parents forget to give themselves a space to do their own grief. They're so worried about their kids often that there's time for their grief, but they are grieving too, right? Like we're grieving too. And how do you parent? How do you caregive for a child who's grieving the shared loss that we have? Right.
That's awesome. Well, I know today we've talked a lot about grief, but given that the holidays are so close, I think I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, first, why the holidays bring up so much for so many of us, but then also what are ways then on that day that I can kind of be kind to myself and support.
Yeah. I think the holidays are hard for people because it's for several reasons. One, I think the biggest reason, it feels like it's this moment that's supposed to be this happy, joyous thing, right?
We've built it up.
We built the expectation that we put on holidays, and some families have a lot of traditions, which is great, that they love. It makes them feel connected. Rituals, traditions are wonderful things. But some families, it creates the expectations and it not going well, and the family blow-ups and the stress of being like, I don't want to be around my cousin, like, and I'm supposed to and now I have to be happy and with them. So there's so many different emotions I think that can come up for people. There's so much that's out of our control. But then this expectation of somehow holidays just automatically make us a happy family. But this may not be a happy time for us. Or we might not all be in the same space of happiness, or our relationships might be really hurting right now, right? But just because there's a tree or a menorah or, all the other holiday, or a turkey means that I'm supposed to be happy, right? And
also, I think with survivors too, right? Like I'm going through a lot of loss of identity or and I am supposed to walk into the room and put on a happy face, even though I'm really struggling right now emotionally.
Right. And so giving ourselves permission to do what we need to do, you can take a break. If it feels overwhelming, and it's maybe a little triggering for our friends who maybe have some PTSD, who find, certain smells overwhelming, or certain just like all the noise. If it's a big family gathering, it's okay to take a break, right?
Mhm.
But then for some of us who are grieving, I don't have a large family. I don't feel like my family's been supportive. It's better for me to not be with family. There's grief and loss of that, right? That my family has not been supportive to me. And so this idea, I think too, of like what family actually is, and just because we share genetics doesn't mean we're family. I think we're lucky if we can say that, but like, who are our chosen family? Reach out to people in your community, ask them for that support, right? Feeling really lonely.
That's a tip I got as a young kid too, of like, family doesn't always have to just be the folks that we were born into. It could also be, you know, our closest friend or someone that has really been there to support us. And I think that is such a powerful tip, because family is who we choose to be around. That's a really beautiful tip, especially around this time of year.
Absolutely. And another thing I talk with my clients a lot about too is this, you know, happiness is, I believe happiness is spontaneous. So that just because we think something, if it doesn't look a certain way, or if it isn't a certain way, or how it looks like all the commercials are telling us it needs to be, means that I'm not going to be happy. I don't know. Happiness is often spontaneous. I mean, how many of you, like the memories you have, it's not of the same ornaments, right? Or the funny things that probably happened, right? Or the sad news that happened, or, you know,
the turkey didn't come out the way I wanted. Yeah.
You know, if we can laugh about those things, like, you know, the things that were kind of funny and are memorable, those things, and also some of the sad things, right? And so that can happen, and like the absence of that person specifically, right? Like happiness might be really hard to find this year and next year. But can I find some peace? Is there some moments of joy because I'm both remembering my loved one, but also, and sad for that, but also remembering a happy memory, a gift that they gave me, a walk we took this time of year, or a tradition that we had, you know?
I think gratitude, right? So like whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas, like finding an opportunity as a family to just be thankful that we are here and able to be together.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I also wanted to add too about just setting expectations for yourself, but also with your family and friends. You know, maybe you can only come to dinner for an hour, but that is a huge improvement from last year, or whatever it may be. But setting those expectations early, I think, you know, for me personally, that's just helped a ton going into those days.
Absolutely. And to add to that, I think we so often look to others for permission to do that. We've got to get the permission to ourselves. If you need dinner for an hour, that's great. Say that's what you're doing. Don't ask. Don't say, is that okay? Because guess what? It's better than you not coming. I'm sure that's what your friends or, you know, are thinking. We'd rather, you know, so, and sometimes, you know, people might hit you, you know, kind of like bombard you with like, but you can come more. And you're like, yeah, I could, but I'm going to plan on an hour. Not just the meal, and I'm gonna see how I feel, but I'm gonna plan for that, and I will let you know if that changes.
And I think not having to tell anyone that too. Like there are times where if I walk into a room and I'm like, I just can't do this today. I know there are times where if I say something to my husband, he knows like, okay, this is all that I can handle today, and I'm done here. So I think,
if you've got that family member or friend or church member that understand, you know, that gets it and can help be an advocate for you, to support you, to not have to explain yourself, and to say, hey, we're going, and you know, can do that. You know, people love to help people. So assign someone that task. Ask them if they can ask a trusted person that, you know, doesn't fully get it, but gets that you need it. Ask them to help you.
My husband and I are really big on having like code words, like when we're going somewhere or something, it's like time to go. Okay, what's our code word going into it, and when are we getting out?
Good word. Yep.
Or texting under the table, like,
Yes.
I'm ready.
But don't look at your phone too quick, or they'll know we're texting.
Yeah, nobody talks about it, but it happens. So
Yes, sure.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Well, I think we're almost at time here, Jen, but before we let each other go, is there anything else that you want to share with those that are watching or listening today about grief for the holidays that we haven't yet talked about?
I think remembering in grief that it's okay to have emotions, right? They will come at us in waves, and sort of as painful as they are, pay attention to them. Let yourself take the opportunity to have the tears. Tears are a wonderful thing in our healing, right? It allows us to move through a stress cycle. Great book on burnout about that. But also that it's okay if you're experiencing grief 5 years, 10 years. It's okay. It's here, right? That compassion, that an acceptance of it's okay to have those emotions. It's okay to be angry still, right? You can be angry once in a while. There's a lot of loss that's happened, right? And the idea of what's so hard for our minds is, people talk about adjusting to that new normal without that person or what my new life looks like, is our brain still holds the old narrative of what we were hopeful to have had our life be like, right? And so sometimes when we're moving through the emotions, it's our brain trying to get back to that narrative, right? That initial narrative. But allowing that narrative and through our emotions allows that narrative to they come back together, right? Sometimes it feels like they're pulling apart, but it allows them to come back together. If we can acknowledge the loss, but also acknowledge, what do I have, right? What actually is okay right now? It's okay that I loved that person. What did I love about them? Let me experience that love, right? Sometimes you forget that the tears aren't just about the absence of them, but the love that we had for them that needs to come out in some way because we can't share it with them in that same way anymore.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Jen, for joining us today. And I do just want to remind our listeners too that there are so many ways to connect, not only with other burn survivors, but just connect with loved ones from all around the world with Phoenix Society. We know you are part of our support group that's hosted on the 2nd and 4th Mondays of every month. We have our weekly peer support chat. We have Phoenix SOAR. We have so many ways. We have a Facebook group. So, when in doubt, reach out to us and we are happy to help however we can. So just thank you again, Jen, so much. You shared so much wisdom with us today, and I'm so excited to have you on again here very soon. I know we gave a little teaser of that, but it'll be another great episode.
Thanks for having me, ladies. It's such an important topic, something that we all experience, and I'm just so honored to have this discussion and sort of share my experiences and with you all. So thank you.
Thanks, Jen. So once again, before we wrap up today, we want to thank our season 1 podcast sponsor, Pritzker Hagman. The Pritzker Hagman Burn Injury Legal Team helps support burn survivors and their loved ones pursue compensation and justice throughout the United States. If you have any legal questions, the attorneys at Pritzker Hagman are ready to help, and you can find out more at legaljourney.guide. Jen, as always, it was such a pleasure. We want to thank you, and we look forward to seeing you very soon. Happy holidays, everyone.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Girls with Grafts. If you are enjoying this content, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.